Hey guys, tonight we slip past the surface of the world and listen for the quiet clink of stone on stone, like someone tapping a secret rhythm deep under your feet, where the air might feel cooler, the shadows longer, and the stories older than the dust on your bookshelf. You're here for Sumerian texts reveal what the Anunnaki were mining deep underground and why. But we'll keep our feet on the safe ground. Some parts are widely accepted history, some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm. What if imagination? Because historians debate a lot more than they agree, and you and I are not here to declare final answers. We're here to follow clues until your eyelids get heavy. And yes, you probably won't survive this. Not because it's scary, but because if you had to haul mud bricks in the Mesopotamian sun all day, you'd last maybe 11 minutes before you started bargaining with the nearest goat for a desk job. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where these sleepy stories land. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing on a plain that looks almost flat from a distance, but it's not flat at all when your feet are doing the measuring. The ground is cracked into pale plates, then softened into darker bands where water once wandered. Somewhere off to the side, reeds whisper against each other and the wind has that dry, grainy feel, like it has been sifting sand through its fingers all afternoon. This is the world that most historians agree the Sumerians knew southern Mesopotamia, the land between rivers where the Tigris and Euphrates don't just water crops. They shape how people think about life. The evidence we do have points to a civilization that built cities out of mud and imagination wrote on clay, and learned to live with water that could be generous one season and cruel the next. Archaeology suggests they raised temples and storehouses, planned canals, measured fields, and argued about boundaries with the kind of passion modern people reserve for parking spaces. And tonight you are going to walk into the idea that the ground beneath those cities mattered as much as the sky above them. Because when you read Sumerian myths with modern eyes, you notice how often below shows up, not just as a direction, but as a place with rules. A place with gates, a place you can travel to, a place where something is kept, a place where something is done. What's broadly accepted is that ancient Mesopotamians had a rich underworld concept, often described as a shadowy realm where the dead went, ruled by powerful figures, and separated from the living by boundaries you weren't supposed to cross casually. In other words, not a cheerful vacation spot, more like the city office where your paperwork goes to disappear. But one interpretation is that underworld imagery does more than talk about death. It might also echo the lived reality of digging, of working pits and canals and foundations, of pulling material from the earth to build the world above. Not because the Sumerians were writing technical manuals in disguise, but because people use familiar things to explain unfamiliar ones. If your society depends on clay, bitumen, reeds and stone, if you spend your days shaping earth into shelter, then the earth stops being background scenery. It becomes an active character. So you start to wonder gently and carefully, what if the story is pointing at something else? You take a few slow steps forward and the plain gives way to a slight depression, a place where the soil looks darker, heavier. In your mind's eye, there's a cut in the ground, maybe a quarry, maybe a borrow pit. The air down there is cooler, the light changes, sound changes too, like the world is wrapped in cloth. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Now, the title you're listening to tonight has a loaded phrase, Anunnaki. In mainstream scholarship, Anunnaki refers to a group of deities in Mesopotamian tradition with meanings and roles that shift across time and texts. They aren't a neat, consistent cast in a single cinematic universe. Ancient religion isn't like that. It's more like a long-running show with multiple writers, and the occasional episode where everyone pretends the previous season didn't happen. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths were not written as journalism. They weren't trying to report events like a modern news broadcast. They were telling stories that held meaning about cosmic order, kingship, labour, justice, mortality, and how the world is supposed to fit together. Archaeology suggests these texts lived alongside real institutions, temples, palaces, workshops, farms and households. That's the solid ground. Then comes the mist. A popular rumour claims that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial visitors mining something deep underground, often gold, for their own purposes. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it shows up everywhere in modern media. It's sticky because it offers a single motive, a single hidden truth, a simple reason for complex stories. And to be clear, this is debated. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes less a declaration and more a storytelling lens, an imaginative filter you can hold up to ancient imagery and see what patterns appear. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. We're asking what materials ancient Mesopotamians actually depended on what underground could reasonably mean in their environment, and why later readers might connect divine figures to extraction work. And you know what's funny? The biggest twist might be that the most important mining in Sumer isn't glamorous at all. It's clay. You look down at your own hands in the imagined lamplight, and there's a dust on your fingers that could be dried river silt. Clay is humble, soft, sticky, annoying when it's under your nails, but it's also civilization in a portable form. The evidence we do have points to clay as the backbone of Mesopotamian life. They built with it. They stored with it, they wrote with it. You want a wall clay bricks. You want a record clay tablet. You want to preserve a transaction for 4,000 years. You press a reed stylus into wet clay and let the sun do the rest. Ancient people didn't need a cloud backup. They had the literal ground. Archaeology suggests that making mud bricks was a massive organised labour activity. You dig and haul, earth mix it with water. Add chopped straw or chaff for strength. Press it into moulds, dry. Stack it and repeat until your shoulders feel like they've been replaced by 2 tired rocks. And yes, you probably won't survive this. Not because it's dramatic, but because your modern spine is accustomed to chairs and a mud brick doesn't care about your ergonomic needs. So when Sumerian texts speak about God shaping humans from clay, or when they describe creation in terms that involve earth and water, and forming what's broadly accepted is that this is mythic language about origins and purpose. One interpretation is that it also reflects the everyday truth that the city itself is made from the same stuff people think they're made from. The metaphor works because it's literally under your feet. Now imagine you're near a city, maybe Uruk, maybe maybe a smaller settlement with a temple mound rising like a low-baked wave. The ziggurat is up there like a stairway for prayers, but down here at the edge of the settlement there are pits where clay is taken. Not deep mines like modern tunnels, more like open borrow pits, scraped earth, shallow cuts. Still it's underground in the sense that you are taking from below the surface. You are reaching into the body of the land. And here's where the underworld feeling sneaks in. You step down into the pit. The sound of the wind softens. The walls of packed earth rise around you. Your voice would echo here, even if you didn't intend to talk, especially if you're the kind of person who talks to yourself while working, which frankly is most humans after hour 3 of repetitive labour. There's a coolness in the shade and the smell is damp, mineral, alive. Your feet sink slightly. You scoop and lift. Scoop and lift. The rhythm becomes your lullaby. This is the scene where the mind starts to make connections. A careful reading might suggest that when myths describe divine beings in the depths, it could be symbolic of realms beyond ordinary sight, but it could also borrow emotional texture from places like this pit's foundations, wells, canals, burial shafts. Places where daylight thins and the world feels different. Historians still argue whether the underworld in Mesopotamian thought is purely a religious concept about death, or whether its imagery also draws from practical experiences of the landscape of digging of hidden water, of subterranean spaces used for storage or burial. There's no full consensus because cultures don't usually separate symbol and reality with a ruler. Now let's widen your view a little. When you walk through a Mesopotamian city in your imagination, you notice that underground isn't just pits. It's foundations, layers of brick, and fill built up over time. Cities were rebuilt again and again on the same spots, forming mounds. Archaeology suggests that these artificial hills are made of accumulated human occupation. The underworld beneath the streets is literally older streets, older houses, older ash, older broken pots. Time is layered like bread. So you can see how below becomes a place where the past lives. Not in a spooky way, in a practical way. The old floor is down there. The old hearth is down there. The old storage jar you forgot about is down there. And it is definitely not still good, so please don't open it like it's a snack. In that layered world, you also find burials. Many Mesopotamian graves were placed under house floors or in designated cemeteries depending on time and region. What's broadly accepted is that burial practices varied, and the underworld was imagined as a destination for the dead. One interpretation is that the act of placing someone beneath the floor, beneath daily life, strengthens the sense that the world below is both present and separate. You walk above it. You live above it. You don't always think about it, but it's there. And this is where the phrase deep underground becomes interesting, not as a literal map to a secret mine, but as a mood, a storytelling depth, a way to say the thing we're talking about isn't on the surface. It's not obvious. It's buried in layers of language and time. So when people today ask, what were the Anunnaki mining deep underground, a mainstream safe anchor, says the texts don't straightforwardly describe gods running mining operations the way a modern corporation would. That's not what these myths are doing on the page. A more cautious explanation could be, if you want to connect mining to Mesopotamian reality, start with the materials that built their world: clay, bitumen reeds, metals acquired through trade, and the labour systems that manage them. And then if you want the cinematic what-if mood, you can let the lamplight deepen and ask, what if the story is pointing at something else? What if underground is where the real machinery of civilization hides? Work, extraction, accounting obligation, while the gods get the credit. You climb back up out of the pit in your mind. The wind hits your face again. The horizon looks wider. And you realise something quietly unsettling in a very bedtime-friendly way. The underworld isn't only a place for the dead. It's also the place where the living store their power, material, labour, memory. Your motif for tonight, the small repeating object, is simple: a reed stylus. You can feel it between your fingers, a sharpened piece of plant light as a twig strong enough to press marks into wet clay. It's humble like the clay itself, and yet it's the tool that turns earth into story. Because as you walk along the edge of the city, you can almost hear it. The soft tick of stylus on tablet, the faint scrape, the pause, the next mark. Like footsteps, like mining if you squint your imagination just right. Historians still argue whether the gods in these texts are best understood as purely religious figures, or whether they also act as symbolic stand-ins for institutions, temples, kings, labour systems that organise society. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it's a useful lens, and it keeps us grounded. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And the first clue, the first scoop of Earth, suggests that the deepest mine in early Mesopotamia might not be a tunnel at all. It might be the very soil that becomes brick tablet and city mined by hands, explained by myth, remembered by clay. You keep walking because the plane doesn't really give you corners to turn, only directions to choose. The air feels dry enough to crack a whisper in half, and your imagined reed stylus, your little motif for tonight, sits behind your ear like a pencil, because apparently your brain has decided you're the kind of person who is organised in a crisis. The city ahead is a low rise of walls and sun-baked shapes, and even before you reach it, you can sense the rhythm inside footsteps, murmurs, animals complaining about being animals, and somewhere the steady, patient sound of something being counted. Most historians agree that when we talk about Sumerian texts, we're not talking about one book written by one author with a clear plot and a satisfying twist on page 3 to 12. We're talking about a long tradition, myths, hymns, royal inscriptions, administrative records, legal documents, letters, proverbs written over many centuries in different cities for different reasons. Archaeology suggests that scribal schools trained students to copy and recopy standard compositions, which is why certain stories survive in multiple versions. One interpretation is that this copying process didn't just preserve tales, it shaped how people thought, smoothing rough edges, emphasizing certain themes, and sometimes making the gods sound like they ran the place, which in a sense they did, at least on paper. And what if, just for a cinematic second, you imagine the scribal school as a sleepy factory of words? You're inside a room where the light is angled through a small opening. The air smells like damp clay and warm bodies, and students sit with tablets on their knees. Their reed styluses tap like tiny metronomes. Someone sighs the way only a student can sigh, like they've personally invented suffering, and the teacher's look says without speaking, yes, you will copy that line again. Now, if your big question is, what were the Anunnaki mining deep underground, and why the first challenge is language itself? The texts don't come with modern labels. They don't say Chapter 4, mining operations and associated deliverables. They speak in metaphors, in lists, in divine genealogies, in poetry that is doing several jobs at once. The evidence we do have points to a world where religion, politics, labour and economics overlap so thoroughly that separating them feels like trying to separate flour from bread after it's baked. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian gods were tied to places and functions cities had, patron deities, temples, managed resources, and kings claimed legitimacy through divine favour. So when you see divine groups like the Anunnaki appear in texts, you're seeing a layer of religious thought that also sits on top of real institutions. One interpretation is that divine hierarchies can mirror social hierarchies: who commands, who obeys, who distributes, who labours. That's not a claim that the gods are just politics. It's a cautious suggestion that myths can reflect lived structures, because stories often borrow from what people know. And what if the underworld, this deep underground mood, functions like a stage where those structures are dramatized? Not because the writers are hiding a secret, but because the underworld is where you can place uncomfortable truths. You can talk about toil and limits and obligation without pointing directly at your boss. You can blame cosmic law instead of the guy who signed your grain ration. You step into the city gate in your imagination and immediately you notice something. This is not a place that runs on vibes. It runs on accounting, on measures, on containers, on the kind of paperwork that makes modern people groan and makes ancient people feel safe, because written records are a way to stabilize a world that keeps trying to flood you. Archaeology suggests that many of the surviving clay tablets are administrative lists of rations, deliveries, workers, animals, land, and materials. This is the boring, glorious backbone of early states. Most historians agree that writing in Mesopotamia developed in part for administration, not for poetry. The poems come later, or at least they survive later. First you count sheep, then you write about gods. That's a simplification, but it's close enough to hold on to as a mainstream safe anchor. Now, when people today talk about Sumerian texts revealing something about mining, a careful reading might suggest that the reveal is less like a shocking confession and more like a slow, patient accumulation of hints about what mattered materials labour and the systems that moved them. You pass a courtyard where workers are mixing clay. You can hear the squelch wet earth being stomped or kneaded. Someone is adding chopped straw. Someone else is carrying water in a jar. The smell is mineral and plant and sweat. If you've ever made bread dough, it's that same kind of work, except instead of dinner, you get architecture. And you can't eat architecture no matter how hungry you are. Trust me, people have tried. One interpretation is that when myths talk about creating humans from clay to serve the gods, they echo the everyday reality that human labour turns Earth into civilization. That's possible, not a certainty, but it's a useful frame. It keeps the story anchored to what archaeology suggests. Large-scale labour projects existed and people were organised to do them. Historians still argue whether the labour themes in Mesopotamian myths should be read primarily as theological explanations of human purpose or as reflections of social tensions in early urban life. There's no full consensus because both can be true at once. A myth can teach a religious lesson and also soothe or justify an economic system. Now you hear the word underground, and your mind might leap to tunnels, caverns, and secret chambers. But in the Mesopotamian, environment below can mean many things. Pits for clay, wells for water, canals cut into earth foundation trenches, storage spaces, burial jars. The evidence we do have points to a landscape where water hides below the surface and must be coaxed out, where building requires digging down before you build up. So deep is often relative deep compared to the flatness of the plain, deep compared to your everyday walking level. And here's where the mythic underworld becomes a powerful metaphor. It takes all those practical below-the-surface experiences and turns them into a realm. Gates become thresholds. Wells become entrances. Burials become journeys. Darkness becomes law. You walk past a temple complex and feel the shift in atmosphere. Temples are not just spiritual spaces. Archaeology suggests they were also economic centres, receiving offerings, distributing rations, employing workers, storing goods. What's broadly accepted is that temples played a major role in early Mesopotamian city life. One interpretation is that the gods' demands, offerings, rituals, maintenance are tied to real flows of resources. When a hymn says a god receives abundance, it might also reflect the temple storehouses filling with grain and wool. Now, bring the Anunnaki back into your mind, but keep the cautious verbs close. In some traditions, they're a group of gods associated with the divine order, sometimes connected to the underworld. Their roles shift depending on time and text. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And because later modern retellings often compress and remix these figures, it's easy to accidentally treat them like a single unified team with one mission. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it's not how ancient religion usually works. So instead of treating the Anunnaki as a mining crew with hard hats, and a quarterly report, a more cautious explanation could be that people today use the name as a placeholder for divine beings connected to the deep, and then ask what that deep might represent. And what if the deep is not a physical mine, but a social one, a place where labour is extracted, a place where obligations are enforced, where the hidden machinery of the city runs? You're not proving anything tonight. You're following clues. You're letting the underworld be a lens. You step into a scribal office, again in your imagination, and you see stacks of tablets drying. Some have neat lines, some are rough practice pieces. A scribe is impressively calm, which is suspicious because anyone who deals with inventory should be at least mildly haunted. He holds your attention with a simple gesture. He sets down a tablet, and you see a list grain. Allocations, labourers, dates, measures. Numbers, names, repetition. This is where reveal begins to mean something different. The texts reveal in their own way that civilization was built on managing resources and labour. The gods in myths demand service. The institutions in reality demand work. That parallel doesn't prove a hidden truth. It raises the possibility that myths can serve as emotional architecture around practical life. Historians still argue whether scribes primarily recorded reality or also shaped it by defining categories, legitimizing authority, and turning messy life into ordered lists. And that matters for your question, because if writing itself is part of the system, then what the texts reveal is both a mirror and a tool. Now let's bring in the cinematic what-if mood without letting it run away. What if you imagine the underworld not as a place of monsters, but as a place of paperwork? A place where every jar of oil, every bundle of reeds, every brick of bitumen is counted and assigned. The gates of the underworld are not iron, they're clay seals pressed with a cylinder seal rolled like a signature. And the guardians are not demons, they're scribes with tired wrists. It's a funny image, and it's also oddly plausible as metaphor, because a sealed tablet is a kind of closed world. You can't change it without breaking it. It's fixed. It's law. And you still in second person, still moving, feel the weight of that. You realise that deep underground might also be where truth is stored. Not truth like cosmic secrets, but truth like receipts, records, the kind of truth that keeps a temple running and a city fed. So when you ask what were they mining, you start to see that mining might mean extracting value from earth, yes, but also from people, from time, from effort, from the quiet endurance of workers who will never be statues. That's an interpretation, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated. But it helps you set up the next step if myths are full of divine labour language and the real world is full of organised extraction and building. Then the overlap is a place worth exploring slowly. Your reed stylus motif comes back. You tap it once against your thumb like a tiny clock. The sound is soft, almost soothing, like the city is breathing through clay. And the question waiting just ahead of you is simple but heavy. If the real materials mattered so much, clay, bitumen, metals, why do later stories and modern rumours fixate on one shiny thing? Why does deep underground feel like it must hide a single treasure? We'll get there. For now, You keep walking, and the fan hum in your room blends with the imagined whisper of reeds outside the city wall. You drift forward without needing a map, because in this landscape the map is mostly just keep the river on your left and don't argue with the sun. The city thins behind you, and now you're closer to the edge of the built world, where the practical side of life shows itself more openly. You hear fewer voices and more work, the drag of a basket, the thunk of something heavy being set down a donkey, making the exact sound of a donkey as if it has signed a contract to complain forever. And this is where you can finally ask the question in a way that stays on solid ground. What did people in ancient Mesopotamia actually extract produce and depend on record in the dirt, in the tablets? Most historians agree that southern Mesopotamia did not have abundant stone timber or metal ores nearby. Archaeology suggests that this geography shaped everything. If you live on a flat alluvial plain, you become brilliant at using what you have, mud reeds, bitumen, and brilliant at acquiring what you don't have through trade. The evidence we do have points to a civilization that is less. We have everything and more. We will invent a bureaucracy and a boat system until everything arrives. So when you hear modern talk about Anunnaki mining deep underground, a mainstream safe anchor says the everyday resource story of Mesopotamia is already dramatic without aliens, because they're building urban life on a landscape that gives them clay and water, then challenges them to import almost everything else. Now let's lay out those resources like objects on a low table in a lamplit room. You can almost touch them. First, clay. We already met it, and it's still on your fingers. Archaeology suggests clay was harvested from riverbanks, canals and pits, shaped into bricks, pottery and tablets. The evidence we do have points to a huge scale of brick production in cities that grew and rebuilt repeatedly. Clay isn't mined like deep ore, but it is extracted from below the surface. It is the ground becoming the city. Second, reeds. What's broadly accepted is that reeds from marshes were vital for baskets, mats, roofing boats, and even the very styluses used to write. You're basically living in a civilization supported by a plant that grows fast and doesn't ask questions. One interpretation is that reed imagery in myths, marshes, boats, woven things carries a practical intimacy, because everyone knows that reed work is how you survive in a watery world. And what if the humble reed is the true technology hiding in plain sight, more essential than any glittering metal? Third, bitumen. Archaeology suggests natural bitumen, seeps and deposits were used as waterproofing and adhesive. It sealed boats, lined baskets, strengthened walls, and helped structures resist moisture. If you want a cinematic detail, bitumen has a smell that grabs you, tar-like, dark, sharp, a hint of smoke, even when there's no fire. It's a material that feels like it belongs to the underworld because it looks like something the earth is bleeding. Most historians agree that bitumen was traded and sourced from places where it naturally surfaced, which means people recognized the landscape's hidden gifts and made them portable. One interpretation is that myths describing black substances or divine gifts of earth could echo the awe people felt when a sticky waterproof material seemed to rise out of the ground on its own. And what if the first deep underground extraction story is really about watching the earth ooze a substance that changes what you can build? Now, beyond these everyday materials, you step into the bigger web metals and stone. What's broadly accepted is that copper was widely used in Mesopotamia, especially as societies moved through the Chalcolithic into the Bronze Age, and later bronze became essential. But southern Mesopotamia didn't have major copper ore sources right there in the plain. Archaeology suggests copper came through long-distance exchange networks from regions like Oman, often linked to ancient Magan in later texts and possibly other areas. The evidence we do have points to trade routes by sea and land that brought copper in as ingot scrap or worked items. And here's a perfect place for your careful language. A popular rumour claims that Sumerian texts describe gods mining metals underground themselves. But a more cautious explanation could be that divine narratives compress and dramatise human networks. In myth, gods can bring resources because gods represent the order of the world. In reality, merchants, sailors and administrators bring resources because they represent the order of the economy. That's an interpretation, not a certainty, but it fits the pattern of how ancient stories often work. Historians still argue whether specific place names in Mesopotamian texts refer to exact geographic locations we can confidently map today, or whether they sometimes function as broader labels for regions and trade partners. And that matters because if you can't pin a place down with certainty, you can't turn a poetic line into a literal travel itinerary for a mining expedition. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Now tin is the quiet magician behind bronze, and it's the one that makes your story feel like a puzzle, even without any fringe theories. Most historians agree that tin sources were distant and that tin trade networks were complex. Archaeology suggests that controlling tin, finding it moving, securing it was a major piece of Bronze Age power. But tin is elusive. It doesn't shout from the ground in most places. It hides in certain deposits, and ancient people had to know where to look, or know someone who knew where to look. One interpretation is that the secrecy and importance of tin could feed into mystery language in myths, hidden sources, guarded knowledge, divine gifts. And what if the deep underground mood is partly the feeling of dependence on a material you can't easily produce yourself? You're waiting on it. You're paying for it. You're negotiating for it. It might as well be magic. Next stone. Archaeology suggests that stone was imported diorite limestone, alabaster, used for statues, vessels and prestige objects. If you've ever held a polished stone bowl, you know it carries a different kind of authority than a clay pot. Clay feels domestic. Stone feels permanent. The evidence we do have points to rulers commissioning stone monuments, partly because stone says I intend to outlast you. And then wood. Timber was limited in southern Mesopotamia. Date palms gave some usable material, and reeds helped, but large beams often required import from farther north or from upland regions. So again, trade becomes survival. Now, if we're building a mainstream safe picture, We're looking at a civilization that mines locally for earth materials, clay bitumen, and mines socially for everything else, metals, stone timber through exchange. But you're here for the underworld question, so let's let the imagination lean in gently. What if deep underground is also a poetic way to describe distance? When something comes from far away, beyond the horizon, beyond the marsh, beyond the mountains, it might as well come from another realm. The mountains in many mythologies are places where the world changes. They're where storms are born, where ores are found, where unfamiliar peoples live. To a city dweller on a flat plain, the mountains can feel like the edge of the map. A careful reading might suggest that divine stories about bringing resources from the depths or from remote realms could reflect that sense of otherness. You don't see where copper comes from. You see it arrive, gleaming already shaped. You don't see the ore vein. You see the finished tool. The origin is hidden. That hiddenness feels like below. Historians still argue whether ancient audiences understood these mythic origin stories as literal geography, symbolic language, or a mix that shifts depending on context, ritual, performance, education, politics. There's no full consensus, and that's okay. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. Now, because we promised a 70% mainstream, 30% mystery balance, we can let one fringe thread peek out, then tuck it back in gently. A fringe idea proposes that certain myths preserve memories of advanced underground extraction machines, tunnels, sealed chambers attributed to the Anunnaki. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because it offers a clean narrative. Mysterious beings came, took something precious and left. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a way to ask, why do humans so often project hidden motives onto the deep places of the earth? One interpretation is psychological. The underground is where we put what we can't easily see, resources, ancestors' secrets. It's where we store both wealth and fear. So of course, stories place powerful beings there. It's a natural stage for the unknown. Meanwhile, the solid ground stays steady. The materials that matter in Mesopotamia are very well documented by archaeology and texts. They are mundane, essential, and enormous in scale. You pause near a storage area, huge jars, baskets, piles of material, and you notice something that makes your sleepy brain smile. Even the mystery is made of inventory. The city runs because someone knows how many bricks were made, how much bitumen is left, how many workers showed up, how many measures of barley are due. Your reed stylus taps again, soft, and you realise you're collecting your own list tonight the way a scribe would. Clay, reeds, bitumen, copper, tin, stone, wood, each one a clue, each one a reason. And the next question, waiting like a door you haven't opened yet, is the one that pulls you toward the shadowed side. Why do myths dress these materials in divine clothing? Why does extraction become sacred? Why does mining become cosmic? We'll step into that slowly with the fan hum steady in the background. You stay with clay a little longer because clay is the kind of truth that doesn't sparkle, and that's exactly why it lasts. You walk along a canal bank where the earth is darker and heavier, and every step feels like it's testing you, like the ground is asking politely if you really meant to show up in sandals. The surface looks dry in patches, but you can feel the moisture underneath, like the land is holding its breath. Archaeology suggests that southern Mesopotamia is an alluvial world built from river-borne silt laid down over long stretches of time. What's broadly accepted is that this silt and clay made farming possible and city building practical, even if it also made floods and salinity a constant headache. The evidence we do have points to the Sumerians and their neighbours becoming masters of a landscape that is both gift and threat. They don't just live on the earth, they negotiate with it. And tonight you are negotiating with the idea of mining in the most literal sense, taking from below the surface to build what stands above it. In modern language, mining conjures shafts, tunnels, helmets, and dramatic headlamps that make everyone look heroic even when they're just trying to find the lunchbox they dropped. But in early Mesopotamia, much of the extraction is closer to borrowing than drilling. You cut into riverbanks, scoop from pits, dredge, sediment, haul it in baskets and shape it. The earth is both quarry and workshop. One interpretation is that this kind of extraction work is so common, so essential, that it seeps into the metaphors of the culture, not as a coded secret, but as a shared sensory background. If your city is made from clay bricks, then creation naturally sounds like brick making. If your records are clay tablets, then memory naturally sounds like something you can hold and stack. If your walls rise from mud, then the boundary between the human world and the earth feels thin, almost conversational. And what if, in a cinematic, what if mood, you imagine the ground itself as a library, not a neat library with quiet rules and soft carpeting. No, this one is loud and dusty and occasionally floods, but still layers of live time pressed into the soil waiting to be read. You move toward a place where workers are gathering earth. The scene is practical, almost boring in the way that feeds sleep baskets go down empty and come up heavy. Feet shuffle, hands smear mud, someone coughs and keeps working. The sound is a steady hush of effort. You can smell wet clay, which is weirdly comforting, like rain on a warm sidewalk, except older, earthier, and definitely not paired with a latte. Most historians agree that mud brick architecture is central to Mesopotamian urbanism, and archaeology suggests that producing bricks at scale requires organised labour and planning. You don't build a city by accident. You build it by repeating the same actions until repetition becomes a skyline. Now your reed stylus motif returns because it belongs here. Writing and building share a material. You press a stylus into clay to make a sign. You press clay into a mould to make a brick. Both acts are about form. Both acts are about making something temporary behave like it's permanent. A careful reading might suggest that when Mesopotamian myths describe humans formed from clay to serve divine purposes, the text is doing theology. But it may also be echoing daily life. People really are shaping clay all the time, so clay becomes the natural language of origin. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated, but it's the kind of debate that makes sense because it sits between religion and routine. Historians still argue whether creation from clay motifs should be read mainly as symbolic statements about human mortality and dependence, or whether they also reflect the social realities of labour-heavy urban life. There's no full consensus, and honestly, it's hard to imagine ancient listeners hearing the story without thinking even for a second about the sticky reality under their nails. You look at the workers again and you notice something else. Clay isn't just used once, it cycles. Bricks crumble, buildings collapse, walls erode, and the material returns to the ground. Cities are rebuilt on their own ruins. Archaeology suggests this long process is why many ancient Mesopotamian sites are Tell's mounds made of accumulated layers of mud brick debris. So the underground beneath a city isn't a natural cave system, it's older city. It's yesterday's street under today's street, like a layered cake where each layer tastes faintly of ash and barley. And what if this is part of why the underworld becomes such a powerful idea here? The world below is literally the past, packed down. You walk above it every day and it holds you up. That's poetic, even if you never say it out loud. You step into the shade of a wall and let your eyes adjust. The wall is thick, built of bricks, stacked with care, plastered and repaired. It looks solid, but you know what? It's fighting water windsalt. What's broadly accepted is that maintaining mud brick structures is constant work. If you stop, the earth tries to reclaim what you borrowed. So a city is not only built, it's maintained like a garden, like a promise. Here's one of those light truths that feels almost like a joke. If you want to time travel to ancient Mesopotamia, don't bring a sword first. Bring a trowel. You'll get hired faster. And if you're hoping for a glamorous role, I'm sorry, but your main character energy is going to be redirected into assistant brick dryer shift begins at sunrise. The temple rises nearby, and you can feel how clay ties everything together. Religion, economy, administration. Archaeology suggests temples and palaces managed large workforces and resources. The evidence we do have points to rations distributed to workers, grain, beer, oil, recorded in administrative tablets, and you can almost see it, a scribe seated near a storeroom doorway rolling a seal, noting a delivery, making the clay remember. One interpretation is that the divine world in myths where gods assign tasks and receive offerings mirrors the institutional world where managers assign labour and storehouses receive goods. Not because it's a conspiracy, but because a society's stories often reflect how it organises itself. Again, that's an interpretation, not a certainty. Now, let's slide one step into the mist and then come right back. A fringe idea proposes that deep underground references in later retellings hint at literal subterranean operations, hidden shafts and caverns where something valuable is extracted. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it borrows the drama of depth and the allure of secrecy. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it invites a calmer question. If ancient Mesopotamians didn't have deep minds in the modern sense under their cities, what deep experiences did they have that could feel underworld-like? And the answer is quietly abundant. pits, wells, foundation trenches, buried rooms, graves, and the layered older city beneath the living one. Depth in Mesopotamia can be physical, but it can also be temporal. Deep means old, deep means hidden, deep means foundational. You walk along a construction area where a trench has been dug for a foundation. The sides are straight enough to show deliberate planning. Men lower baskets of earth. Someone levels the base. Someone checks alignment, and you can almost hear them mutter the ancient equivalent of, "If this is crooked, don't look at me. I just work here." Your modern brain wants to ask where the safety rails are, but ancient labour does not care about your modern expectations. It barely cares about your hydration. And yet there's something soothing in the steadiness. Clay is patient. It waits to be shaped. It waits to be written on. It waits to be a wall. It waits to become a mound that future archaeologists will carefully peel back, like people unwrapping a gift that is mostly dirt, but occasionally a miracle. So when you hear Anunnaki are mining deep underground, you keep your solid ground in sight. The most documented, most pervasive extraction in early Mesopotamia is the borrowing of earth itself. The underworld is the clay pit. The underworld is the foundation trench. The underworld is the old city under the new city. And what if when ancient storytellers place powerful beings below, they are also placing power where power truly sits in foundations, in the material that holds everything up, in the quiet labour no one applauds because everyone assumes it will always be there. Your reed stylus taps once more, soft as a heartbeat. You keep walking and the air smells faintly of damp earth and sun-warmed brick, like the world is half-baked and still becoming. You leave the clay pits behind and follow a smell that feels almost too vivid for a bedtime story. Sharp, tar-like, dark as if someone spilled night onto the ground. Even in your imagination, bitumen announces itself. It's not shy. It's the kind of material that seems to whisper, "Yes, I came from below, and yes, I'm going to stick to everything you love." Archaeology suggests bitumen was an essential resource in Mesopotamia, especially for waterproofing. What's broadly accepted is that in a land shaped by rivers, marshes and seasonal floods, keeping water where you want it and out of where you don't becomes a daily obsession. The evidence we do have points to bitumen used on boats, baskets, buildings, and sometimes in canal-related work. If clay is the body of the city, bitumen is its skin, the layer that keeps it from dissolving back into mud the first time the river gets moody. You step closer to a work area where bitumen is being heated. The scene feels half workshop, half campfire. There's a pot over a low flame and the substance inside glistens thickly. The heat carries that smell, tar and smoke, and something mineral. Someone stirs it with a stick and the stick comes out lacquered black. A worker uses a tool to smear it along a seam. Slow and careful, like frosting a cake you absolutely cannot eat. And what if in that cinematic what-if mood, you imagine this as the earliest form of industrial magic? Not a spell, not a secret machine, just chemistry and heat, watched and repeated until it becomes reliable. The underworld gives you a black gift, and you turn it into a boat that won't leak. Most historians agree that bitumen could be obtained from natural seeps and deposits, sometimes at a distance from the cities that needed it most. Archaeology suggests trade and transport moved bitumen across regions. One interpretation is that people would naturally treat a substance that emerges from the ground already sticky, already useful, as something uncanny. It feels like the earth producing its own tool. And here's where underworld imagery makes emotional sense. Bitumen looks like something from a deep place. It's dark, it's heavy, it can burn, it can seal. If you wanted a symbol for the boundary between worlds, you could do worse than a black paste that closes cracks. Historians still argue whether the strong underworld associations we feel with bitumen today are shaped more by modern imagination than by ancient intention, since ancient people may have simply considered it a practical material. That's a fair debate. But even if it was mostly practical, the sensory impression is so powerful that it's hard not to see how it could become poetic over time. You watch a worker coat the seam of a reed boat. Reeds woven tight, shaped into a hull, then sealed with bitumen. Archaeology suggests that watercraft were crucial for Mesopotamian life, moving people grain, timber, stone, and all the other things the plain can't easily provide. Boats are the bloodstream of the river world, and bitumen is the clotting agent that keeps the blood inside the vessel. One interpretation is that myths and religious texts that emphasize order over chaos, boundaries, seals gates, might be resonant in a society that depends on sealing things, sealing boats, sealing baskets, sealing doors with clay lumps and cylinder seals. And what if the deep underground mining in your title isn't about glittering ore, but about extracting substances that help maintain boundaries between water and dry land, between stored goods and hungry hands, between the living city and the river that always wants to rearrange it? Now your reed stylus motif nudges you again, because sealing and writing are cousins. A scribe rolls a cylinder seal on clay to close a container or authenticate a tablet. The seal leaves a pattern, tiny figures, animals, symbols. It's art, identity, authority, and security all at once. And clay again is the medium that records the press of a hand. So the city's underground story becomes layered clay is borrowed from pits. Bitumen is gathered from seeps. Both are shaped into walls and boats and records. The earth is not a backdrop, it's a supply chain. You walk past storehouses where jars and baskets are stacked, and you can hear the soft rattle of reeds shifting. Someone is carrying a sealed container, clay stopper, bitumen smear, maybe a cord. The act of sealing is quiet but powerful. It says, this is mine, or this is the temple's, or this is accounted for. It says, don't touch unless you want a problem. A careful reading might suggest that when myths describe gods, establishing order, assigning roles, distributing goods, setting boundaries, they could be echoing this daily obsession with containment. Again, we'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. That's interpretation, not certainty. Historians still argue whether temple economies in early Mesopotamia were primarily redistributive systems centered on religious institutions, or whether they coexisted with vibrant private trade. in ways that changed over time and place. There's no full consensus because the evidence varies by period and region, but what's broadly accepted is that temples were major players in resource management, and bitumen would have been part of that material world. Now let's give your mystery side its small share softly framed. A popular rumour claims that the black substance is evidence of advanced underground extraction by non-human beings, sometimes tied to Anunnaki stories, in modern retellings. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because bitumen feels like a signature, something the earth hands you that seems too perfectly suited for a water-based civilization. To be clear, this is debated, and the mainstream explanation remains strong. Bitumen is a natural resource used widely in the ancient Near East for practical purposes. You don't need aliens to explain waterproofing. Humans are fully capable of inventing sticky solutions when their boats keep leaking and their patience runs out. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask a quieter what if ancient people encountering bitumen seeps felt the same kind of awe that later readers feel when they imagine hidden chambers underground? What if the deep is less about a literal mine and more about the sensation of Earth producing unexpected gifts? You step closer to the edge of a bitumen seep in your mind. It's not a dramatic lava flow. It's slower, darker, like the ground is sweating. The surface glistens. A worker scrapes some into a container, careful not to waste it. That motion scrape, collect, carry, looks like mining in miniature. Not a tunnel, but an extraction. And what if that's the real link, the act itself? The idea that value can come from below, not planted or grown, but gathered from the hidden places. Your host's voice, sleepy but slightly sarcastic, wants to point something out. You can tell how important a material is by how annoyed people get when it's missing. If the bitumen shipment doesn't arrive, boats leak, baskets fail walls, weep moisture, and suddenly everyone is doing extra work. Civilization, it turns out, is held together by a long list of small things that must not run out. Bitumen is one of those. You walk away from the workshop and the smell fades to a faint trace like a memory. But the idea stays. The underworld isn't only about death. It's also about substances that emerge from below and keep life above functioning. So if someone asks, what were they mining? You can answer on solid ground. They extracted earth materials, clay and bitumen, because those are essential to building and waterproofing in a river world. And if someone asks, why does it feel so mysterious? You can answer in mist, because the deep places of the earth have always felt like they hold something we need but can't easily control. Historians still argue whether the emotional power of depth in ancient texts is mainly religious symbolism or also grounded in material experience. And tonight we're not forcing a decision. We're letting both possibilities breathe. Your reed stylus taps once against your thumb. The fan hum continues, and somewhere outside your imaginary city, the river moves steadily as if it's reading the landscape like a long, slow sentence. You let the bitumen smell fade, and in its place comes something sharper and cleaner metal. Not the loud clang of a modern factory, but the quieter, older sound of a hammer tapping a shape into usefulness. It's a sound that feels like civilization tightening a bolt. You follow it through narrow streets, past walls patched with fresh mud, past doorways where shadows hang like curtains. The air is warmer here, and it carries a mix of smoke, sweat, and something slightly sweet, maybe beer, because in Mesopotamia beer has a way of showing up like a recurring character with excellent job security. Archaeology suggests that metalworking existed in Mesopotamia early on, and what's broadly accepted is that copper became widely used for tools, ornaments, and later for weapons, even if the metal itself often had to be acquired through trade. The evidence we do have points to a world where metal is valuable not only because it shines, but because it lasts and cuts and holds an edge. Clay builds walls, yes, but metal makes the tools that build the walls. You arrive at a workshop doorway and pause. Inside, a smith is working maybe with copper, maybe with an alloy, depending on time period and availability. The fire is low and controlled. A piece of metal sits on a stone or anvil-like surface. The hammer taps. Tap, tap, tap. It's almost hypnotic, like a metronome for the sleepless. Most historians agree that southern Mesopotamia lacked large local sources of metal ore, which means copper had to come from elsewhere. Archaeology suggests long-distance trade networks connected Mesopotamian cities to regions rich in copper, including places often associated with ancient trade terms like Magan. One interpretation is that when myths describe gods bringing metals, they may be echoing the reality that metals arrive from far away in ways that felt almost miraculous. You don't see the mine, you don't see the mountain, you see the ingot appear in a storeroom, and suddenly you have knives, hooks, chisels, and the ability to shape wood and stone more effectively. And what if, for a cinematic, what if you imagine the journey of copper as a descent and ascent? The metal begins in a mountain vein hidden inside rock, then is pulled out, smelted, shaped, traded, carried, and finally ends up in a city built of mud. In a sense, it travels from one underworld to another, from the hidden inside of a mountain to the storerooms beneath a temple's authority. A careful reading might suggest that ancient texts often treat mountains as liminal places, edges of the known world, sources of storms, sources of stones and metals. That's not because the writers are geologists. It's because mountains are where the earth shows its bones. To a city dweller on a flat plain, mountains feel like another realm, almost like the sky turned into rock. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian myths that involve remote regions and divine journeys should be read as symbolic geography, references to real trade relationships, or a layered mix that shifts over time. There's no full consensus, and tonight we don't need one. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. Now you step deeper into the workshop and notice the ordinary magic of skill. The smith knows how hot is hot enough. He knows when a piece is ready to be shaped. He knows which tool to use without thinking too hard about it, the way you might know where the light switch is in your own room at night. This is expertise, and in an ancient world, expertise is power. One interpretation is that metallurgical skill could easily be framed as divine or secret in myths, because it looks like transformation rock becomes metal, becomes tool, becomes change. If you're someone who has never seen smelting, it might feel like pulling sunlight out of stone. Even if you have seen it, it still feels like a small miracle. What's broadly accepted is that copper alone has limitations. It's relatively soft compared to bronze. Archaeology suggests that the development and spread of bronze and alloy of copper with tin was a major shift in the ancient world. Most historians agree that bronze tools could be harder and more durable, though the exact advantages vary by composition and use. The evidence we do have points to tin being a crucial and often distant resource, making bronze economies dependent on trade networks that could stretch far. And here comes your sleepy mystery, because tin is where the story starts to feel like a secret, even when it's just logistics. Tin sources are not evenly distributed, and ancient people had to secure supply routes. A more cautious explanation could be that the mystery language around metals in later stories reflects the fact that many city dwellers never saw the source. They only saw the finished product and the social power it created. Now let's do the required gentle dip into fringe territory, carefully labelled. A fringe idea proposes that ancient texts and later interpretations hint at a hidden centralized motive, often framed as powerful beings seeking specific minerals and metals, sometimes imagined as deep underground extraction far beyond what ancient technology could do. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives because metals feel like the kind of thing someone would cross worlds for. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a storytelling lens. It asks why we're drawn to the idea that valuable materials must have a dramatic origin. To be clear, this is debated. The mainstream view remains. Mesopotamian access to metals is well explained by trade metallurgy and the geography of resources. Humans do not need non-human managers to want copper, because humans already want copper with impressive dedication. You watch the smith quench a tool, maybe dipping it into water, steam rises, the sound hisses, the smell changes. Suddenly, the piece looks darker, steadier. The act feels like a tiny ritual, even if it's just technique. In a world where temple rituals are common, it's easy to see how craft itself could be ritualized or mythologized. One interpretation is that the sacred and the technical are not separate worlds in ancient Mesopotamia. They overlap. Temples manage resources, craftsmen work in or near temple economies, and myths speak about divine order in ways that resonate with human order. Again, that's interpretation, not certainty. Historians still argue whether the primary driver of early Mesopotamian state formation was control of irrigation and agriculture, control of trade and craft production, or a combination that shifts across periods. There's no full consensus because different cities and times show different patterns, but the evidence we do have points to metals being part of a larger web: tools, prestige, exchange, and power. Now your reed stylus motif comes in quietly, because writing and metal share something. They both require specialization. Not everyone can smelt. Not everyone can read. Those who can hold a kind of leverage. A scribe can make obligations permanent. A smith can make tools that change what is possible. If you squint, both are extracting something. The smith extracts function from metal. The scribe extracts order from chaos. And what if deep underground in your title is partly about that extraction of capability? Not literal tunnels, but deep systems, deep skills, deep supply chains, deep dependencies. The city's surface looks simple, walls, houses, people. But beneath it lies an invisible network of resources, moving in labour, moving around authority, moving through records. You step out of the workshop and the tapping fades behind you, replaced by the soft roar of the river wind. Somewhere a donkey brays again, which is the ancient equivalent of an email notification, annoying, constant and impossible to ignore. So the solid ground stays steady copper and bronze matter, and Mesopotamia relies on trade to get the raw materials. The mist hovers where it should. Myths might echo this dependence by dressing resource flows in divine language. And the cinematic what if can linger gently. What if the stories of gods in the depths are not about literal mining shafts, but about the hidden foundations of power materials and systems that most people never see but everyone relies on? Historians still argue whether the way ancient texts speak about resources is mainly metaphorical theology or also a reflection of economic reality, and tonight we're letting that question remain open like a doorway with warm lamplight spilling out. Your reed stylus taps once. Tap. Like a heartbeat, like a hammer, like a clue. You follow the metal trail until it turns into something quieter than a workshop, quieter even than a storehouse. It turns into a conversation, low voices, careful words, and the soft scrape of a seal being rolled over clay. This is the sound of agreements being made, the sound of bronze being born, not just from fire, but from relationships. Because bronze is not one thing. It's a partnership. Most historians agree that bronze is typically an alloy of copper and tin, and archaeology suggests that controlling access to both components shaped economies and power structures across the ancient world. The evidence we do have points to tin being rarer and more distant for Mesopotamia than copper, making bronze production dependent on trade routes and trust networks. In other words, you can have all the copper in the storeroom, but if tin doesn't show up, you're basically holding half a recipe and a lot of frustration. You pause near a courtyard where a merchant is talking to an official, maybe temple associated, maybe palace associated, depending on time and place. The merchant's hands move as he talks like he's counting invisible measures in the air. The official listens, then presses a seal onto clay as if to say, yes, the city remembers this now. Archaeology suggests that many administrative tablets are about exactly this kind of thing. Deliveries, quantities, obligations. What's broadly accepted is that writing and sealing helped make exchange more reliable by making it recordable. One interpretation is that these records don't just reflect trade, they enable it. They turn trust into a system. And what if in a cinematic? What if you imagine tin as a ghost ingredient? You rarely see it. You rarely hear about it directly unless you're in the right circles. But when it's missing, everything changes. Tools get softer. Edges dull faster. Repairs become constant. The city feels it in 1,000 small inconveniences. Tin then becomes the kind of resource that can feel almost mythic. Not because it's magical, but because it's elusive. A careful reading might suggest that ancient stories about hidden sources, guarded knowledge, and divine gifts could resonate more strongly in societies dependent on distant materials. If your well-being depends on something you can't produce yourself, you naturally build narratives around it, narratives of favour, of fate, of gods smiling or frowning. A more cautious explanation could be that the gods gave is a cultural way of speaking about uncertainty and dependence, not a literal claim of divine delivery. Historians still argue whether the Bronze Age expansion of trade networks was driven more by state institutions like temples and palaces, or by private merchants operating alongside them, and there's no full consensus because different periods show different balances. But the evidence we do have points to complex systems where both institutions and individuals played roles. Now your title keeps tugging deep underground. Tin often comes from cassiterite deposits, sometimes associated with upland or mountainous regions, and not usually in the flat alluvial zone where Sumerian cities sit. So if you want to imagine deep underground mining in a physical sense, you're more likely to picture it in distant landscapes, hills and mountains, rather than directly beneath Uruk streets. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamians imported many raw materials, and one interpretation is that distant sources could be conceptualized as otherworldly simply because they are outside daily experience. Mountains are visually dramatic. They look like the world lifting its shoulders. To someone who lives on a plain, they can feel like the boundary between realms. And what if the underground in your story is less about literal depth and more about hidden supply lines? The tin doesn't arrive with a parade. It arrives quietly, in a bundle, in a jar, in an ingot. It passes through hands and storerooms. It is accounted for in tablets that sit on shelves. The average person never sees it. The city's strength depends on something invisible. That invisibility is fertile ground for myth. You walk past a scribal room again because your reed stylus motif keeps bringing you back. You see a student practicing numbers and measures. He presses wedges into clay, then smooths them and tries again. The teacher watches like a hawk that learned math. The student's face says, if I ever invent a time machine, I'm using it to go to a future where calculators exist. But calculators won't help you if you can't read. And that's the point literacy becomes a form of power. One interpretation is that the people who control records, who can write, seal and store agreements, also control resource flows. That's not a conspiracy, it's a structural reality in many complex societies. And what if this is part of why divine figures in myths are portrayed as assigning roles and distributing goods? It mirrors the institutional reality of allocation. Now we promise the mystery side its place, so here it comes, gently. A popular rumour claims that the Anunnaki were after tin or other strategic minerals because they needed alloys for advanced technology, and that deep underground refers to hidden extraction beyond human knowledge. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it's appealing because it makes bronze feel like a clue in a larger puzzle. To be clear, this is debated and the mainstream explanation remains strong. bronze economies thrive or struggle based on trade access and political stability. Humans will happily reorganize entire societies around a good tool material without any outside prompting. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the rumour invites a more grounded question. Why do certain materials become story magnets? Why do we wrap them in cosmic language? One interpretation is that scarcity plus importance equals myth. If a material is essential and hard to secure, it gains symbolic weight. It becomes a stand-in for fortune, favour and order. That's not unique to Mesopotamia. You can see it in any era. Today people treat certain resources, energy, rare metals, microchips, like they're the keys to the universe. We just use different words. And here's your light joke for the 1,000. If you think modern supply chains are stressful, imagine being responsible for securing tin shipments when your main method of communication is send a runner hope he doesn't get lost, and maybe ask the gods nicely. You'd age 6 years per caravan. You walk along a warehouse row where goods are stacked, bales of wool, jars of oil, bundles of reeds, maybe a small sealed container that holds something heavier than it looks, tin perhaps. The official who oversees the storeroom watches it like a cat watches a fish. Not because he's evil, but because the city's stability is literally stored in these spaces. A careful reading might suggest that underworld imagery gates, guardians, rules could be emotionally linked to storage and control. What's broadly accepted is that underworld myths often involve gates and restrictions. One interpretation is that those motifs resonate in a society where access to resources is gated by seals, by authority, by records. Historians still argue whether myths about divine assemblies and judgments reflect political practices like councils and court proceedings, or whether the resemblance is coincidental, because both are ways humans imagine order. There's no full consensus, but the overlap is suggestive, not conclusive. And now you feel the story's texture shifting. Tin and bronze are no longer just materials. They're symbols of how civilizations depend on what they cannot directly touch. The deep underground becomes a metaphor for hidden dependence on distant minds, on distant partners, on systems of record and seal. Your reed stylus taps softly against your thumb again, and you can almost hear the wedge marks in the clay, the sound of a city trying to hold itself together with accounting. So tonight on Solid Ground you remember bronze is a trade story, and tin is the quiet driver of that story. In the mist, you allow myths may cloak this dependence in divine language, and in the cinematic what, if you see the underworld as the network beneath the surface, roots, agreements, storerooms, seals without needing to imagine a literal tunnel beneath every temple. Historians still argue whether the biggest mysteries of Mesopotamian resource history are about what was mined or about how the systems of distribution actually worked day to day. And that's a question that can lull you into sleep because it's both important and wonderfully painfully detailed. You keep walking. You feel it before you see it, a flicker. Not the warm orange of a hearth, but a cooler, sharper gleam that seems to catch light and throw it back like a quiet dare. Gold does that. Even when you're trying to be calm and sensible, gold shows up like a guest who knows everyone will look at them. Most historians agree that gold was valued in ancient Mesopotamia as a prestige material used for ornaments, ritual objects, and displays of wealth. Archaeology suggests that gold was acquired through trade and exchange rather than mined locally on the southern alluvial plain. The evidence we do have points to gold's importance not as a daily tool material like copper, but as a symbol of power, favour and distance, because anything rare feels like it travelled from another realm. You step into a space where a small group is gathered, maybe a temple courtyard, maybe a palace adjacent room. The air is quieter here, and the quiet feels expensive. Someone opens a container, and inside there's a piece of gold, beaten thin, shaped into a leaf, or perhaps a small ornament. The light catches it, and for a moment your sleepy brain goes, "Oh, that's why people lose their minds over this." But you keep your feet on the ground. You remember your safety phrase bank. You remember, we're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. Because gold is where modern rumours love to plant their flag. A popular rumour claims that the Anunnaki were mining gold deep underground for purposes beyond human understanding. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because it offers a single shiny answer to a messy ancient world. They came for gold, end of story. It's neat, it's cinematic, it's easy to remember. To be clear, this is debated. A more cautious explanation could be that gold's symbolic power makes it a perfect anchor for later speculative retellings. Gold is rare, durable, and visually striking. It doesn't tarnish easily, it feels eternal, so it becomes a convenient stand-in for the ultimate resource. If you want your myth to have one object that matters most, gold is an obvious pick. But what's broadly accepted is that the surviving Mesopotamian texts do not straightforwardly describe Anunnaki mining gold underground in the way a modern person might imagine. Ancient myths speak in layered imagery, not corporate memos. Archaeology suggests gold objects existed and were cherished, but their presence is well explained by human desire, trade, and social display. Humans have never needed a cosmic excuse to want shiny things. We will cross deserts for a necklace on our own initiative, thank you very much. You watch as the gold is handled with care, not because it's radioactive, but because it's expensive, and expensive things inspire gentleness. Someone weighs it, someone counts it, someone records it. Your reed stylus motif shows up again. A scribe presses marks into clay, making the gold's existence official. And what if, in that cinematic, what if you imagine the underworld not as a mine, but as the hidden path gold takes into the city? The gold comes from far away, maybe from river regions, mountainous areas, or other networks. We can't always pin down precisely. It moves through hands, contracts, and storerooms. It disappears into temple treasuries and palace rooms. The average person sees gold rarely, if ever. So when gold does appear, it feels almost supernatural. One interpretation is that this distance and rarity feeds the language of divine gifting. When something precious arrives from beyond the horizon, it's easy to say the gods favoured you. A careful reading might suggest that divine favour language functions partly as social messaging. It tells everyone our city is connected, our leaders are successful, the world flows toward us. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Historians still argue whether royal and temple displays of wealth in early Mesopotamia were primarily about religious devotion, political legitimacy, competitive prestige between cities, or some blend that shifts over time. There's no full consensus, and it likely changes depending on the ruler, the city, and the century. Now let's make the mining question more tangible. If gold was acquired mostly through exchange, why does deep underground keep showing up in modern imagination? Part of it is simply that gold, in many places, is literally mined from the earth. So the phrase matches the global story of gold, even if it doesn't match the local geology of southern Mesopotamia. But another interpretation is psychological gold invites origin myths. People want to believe that something so dazzling must come from somewhere hidden and dramatic. That impulse isn't new. The ancient world also told stories about extraordinary origins, stones falling from the sky, divine gifts, sacred rivers. The difference is that modern retellings sometimes attach those impulses to a specific named group and a specific motive. If we treat the Anunnaki mining claim as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask, what might ancient deep imagery be doing instead? What if deep underground is a metaphor for the deep social layers where wealth is held, treasuries, sealed rooms, guarded storage? Because where is gold kept? Not on the street, not in the open. It's kept behind doors, behind seals, behind authority. You walk past a door with a clay seal on it, perhaps marked with a cylinder seal impression, perhaps tied with cord. The seal is small, but it's powerful. It says entry is controlled. It says there are gates here, even in the living world. And suddenly, the underworld gate motif clicks in a new way. What's broadly accepted is that underworld myths involve gates and restrictions. One interpretation is that those images resonate because people live in a world of controlled access, storerooms, treasuries, temple spaces. The underworld in myth becomes the ultimate locked room. Historians still argue whether the gates of the underworld motif is purely religious symbolism, or whether it also draws from lived experiences of city gates, temple gates, and administrative control. There's no full consensus, but the overlap is suggestive, not conclusive. Now, because we're sleep-friendly, let's keep it gentle. You imagine a fringe storyteller in a later era hearing about Anunnaki and underworld assemblies, hearing about gold in temple treasuries, and then connecting the dots into a single clean narrative. They mined gold underground. It's a story that feels satisfying. It gives you a reason. It gives you a villain or a motive. It gives you a neat box to put the messy world in. But the ancient world rarely fits neat boxes. The evidence we do have points to a more complex picture. Multiple deities, multiple myths, multiple resource flows, multiple motivations, changing over time. So your job tonight is not to accept or reject the rumour like a courtroom verdict. Your job is to hold it softly and ask what it reveals about us, about our hunger for single answers, and about them, about a society that placed extraordinary meaning on materials and the systems that moved them. And here's your light joke. If gold really were the only motive behind everything, the ancient world would have invented jewellery subscription services and called it divine destiny. Instead, they invented accounting, which is honestly more terrifying. You look at the gold again and you notice how small it is compared to the city's needs. Gold doesn't build walls. Gold doesn't make ploughs. Gold doesn't waterproof boats. It signals. It concentrates. It sits still and speaks loudly without doing much work. That's what prestige materials do. So when you think about why, in your title you can offer a mainstream safe anchor. Gold is valuable for social and symbolic reasons, and it flows through trade and elite display. You can offer an interpretation. Myths and divine language might amplify that value and frame it as favour. And you can offer a cinematic what if the deep underground isn't a mine at all, but the locked, sealed spaces where wealth sleeps, quiet, guarded, and strangely alive in the imagination. Historians still argue whether the strongest mystery in the Anunnaki gold narrative comes from the ancient texts themselves or from modern reinterpretations layered on top. And tonight we're letting the question remain open because open questions are softer than conclusions. Your reed stylus taps once in the quiet. The gold gleams once, then the container closes and the light goes ordinary again. You leave the gold behind, not because it stops being tempting, but because it stops being useful. Gold can hold your attention for a long time while doing absolutely nothing practical, which is basically the same skill your phone has. Instead, you follow the more honest heartbeat of the city, the temple, not the temple as a postcard image, but the temple as an engine, an organizer, a storehouse, a scheduler of humans. Archaeology suggests that temples in Mesopotamia were not only places of worship, but also major economic institutions managing land, labour and goods. What's broadly accepted is that many surviving texts are administrative and connected to institutional life, rations, offerings, allocations, work assignments. The evidence we do have points to a world where sacred and practical are braided so tightly that pulling them apart would unravel the whole rope. You walk into the temple precinct and the air changes. It feels cooler in the shade of thick walls. You smell incense faintly, but also grain, lots of grain, because sacred places are often suspiciously close to storage. You hear low chanting somewhere and you hear something else too. The scrape of jars, the murmur of workers, the quiet authority of a person telling another person where to stand. One interpretation is that when myths speak of gods receiving offerings and assigning tasks, they may echo the reality of temples receiving goods and organising labour. That doesn't mean the myths are really about bureaucracy. It means myths can ride on the back of lived experience. A careful reading might suggest that divine scenes are often populated with roles that make sense in an administrative world. Messengers, stewards, gatekeepers, judges. And what if in a cinematic, what if the temple complex is your underground mine tonight. Not because it has tunnels, but because it extracts something valuable every day: time, effort, skill. The temple turns human labour into bricks, canals, textiles and bread, then turns those products into stability and prestige. It's a transformation chain, and it runs quietly, like your fan humming in the background. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian temples employed workers and supported craft production, including textile work, food preparation, and construction projects. Archaeology suggests large-scale labour was organised and recorded, with rations distributed to workers. The evidence we do have points to systems that can feel surprisingly modern: lists of names, quantities, dates, responsibilities. You step into a scribal corner again, because of course you do, and you see tablets being made, dried, stored. Your reed stylus motif becomes more than a prop. It becomes a symbol of how the city holds itself together. A scribe presses wedge marks into clay, and suddenly a person's work becomes legible, accountable, repeatable. One interpretation is that writing is a kind of extraction. It pulls fleeting moments, deliveries, promises, labour days out of the flow of time and pins them down. In that sense, the deep underground might be the archive itself: stacks of clay tablets stored in rooms that are cool, dark and sealed. The city's memory lives there, away from sunlight, like an underworld of records. Historians still argue whether writing in early Mesopotamia primarily served state and temple administration, or whether it also quickly expanded into broader cultural uses in ways that changed power dynamics. And there's no full consensus, because the balance shifts over centuries. But what's broadly accepted is that administration is a major driver of the tablet tradition. Now, you can't talk about temples and labour without touching the uncomfortable edge. Why do so many myths describe humans working for gods? Why do some stories place toil at the centre of cosmic order? A careful reading might suggest that labour myths provide a framework for explaining why work exists at all. If life is hard, if you must dig canals, haul clay, repair walls, secure trade, then a myth that says this is your role in the universe can be psychologically stabilising. A more cautious explanation could be that these myths both reflect and justify systems of organised labour. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian labour organisation should be understood primarily as coercive, as reciprocal work in exchange for rations and protection, or as a shifting mix that varies by institution and time. There's no full consensus, but the evidence we do have points to ration systems and managed workforces that could include different statuses of workers. Now your title's Anunnaki thread comes back, and we hold it carefully. In some traditions, the Anunnaki are a group of deities involved in divine order, sometimes linked in later texts to underworld contexts. Their roles are not static. One interpretation is that divine assemblies in myths can be read as dramatizations of decision-making: who gets what, who does what, who is judged. Not because it's literally a temple meeting minutes, but because the social world of meetings and allocations is familiar. And what if the mining in your title is actually this? the extraction of surplus grain collected and stored, wool gathered and spun, labour organised and directed. The temple takes in offerings and produces redistributed goods, creating a flow that keeps the city alive. It is in economic terms an engine of accumulation and distribution. That's mainstream adjacent enough to be useful, but we'll label it as interpretation, because ancient economies are complicated and the evidence varies. Now we promised a small dip into fringe territory, again softly framed. A fringe idea proposes that temple systems and mythic labour stories hide references to non-human overseers extracting resources from humans, sometimes tied to Anunnaki narratives in modern retellings. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it catches attention because it turns bureaucracy into conspiracy. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can still serve as a thought experiment. What does it feel like to be managed by a system you can't see or control? And the answer without aliens is it can feel like the underworld. Not terrifying, just inevitable. A list exists. A seal exists. A ration exists. Your name is on a tablet. The tablet will outlast you, which is both impressive and a little rude. Here's your light joke. If you ever feel overwhelmed by modern paperwork, just remember that ancient Mesopotamia invented bureaucracy on clay. At least your forms don't weigh 3 pounds and require a kiln to finalise. You walk past a storeroom doorway where sacks of grain sit piled like sleeping animals. You smell barley. You hear a worker coughing softly. You hear the scrape of a seal being applied to a door closure. The room becomes off limits. A gate has been made. And suddenly the underworld imagery feels less abstract. Gates, guardians, rules, restricted access. It's all here in the living world, just translated into administrative materials. Historians still argue whether the symbolism of gates in Mesopotamian underworld narratives is primarily derived from city gate experiences and administrative control, or whether it arises independently from universal human ideas about thresholds and death. There's no full consensus, but the resonance is undeniable, even if we can't prove a direct link. This might support the idea that lived urban life influenced mythic imagery. Now, to bring it back to the contract of your outline, this section promised temples as factories, not just prayer. So you stand in the temple precinct and listen. The chanting is there, yes, but so is the counting. The temple is a place where the sacred is performed and the practical is managed. It is a place where resources flow in, are stored, are transformed, and flow out. It is a place where stories of divine order make sense, because the human world is also obsessed with order. And what if the deepest mine is simply the system itself? The way it extracts effort and converts it into stability, like clay becoming brick, like grain, becoming bread, like a name, becoming a number on a tablet. You tap your reed stylus once softly, like you're signing a document in your own mind. The fan hum keeps steady. The temple shadow stretches across the ground, and you feel the city's hidden machinery turning slow and sure. You drift out of the temple precinct and toward the thing that never stops moving, even when everyone else is tired: water. In a river world, water is both a blessing and a bully. It gives you life, then it turns around and tests whether you deserve it. And you can't exactly file a complaint with a river. You can try, but it will just flood you out of spite. Archaeology suggests irrigation was fundamental to Mesopotamian agriculture and urban life. And what's broadly accepted is that managing water through canals, levees and ditches required organised labour and long-term planning. The evidence we do have points to a landscape where water is power, because whoever controls water controls food, and whoever controls food controls the city's mood, which is most of politics, ancient or modern. You walk along a canal, and the air is cooler here. The sound is steady water sliding reeds, whispering insects doing their tiny, relentless jobs. The canal banks are cut into the earth, and you can see layers of soil darker near the waterline. This is underground in the simplest way. Water is hiding just below the surface, flowing through channels you carved, waiting to seep where you didn't ask it to. One interpretation is that Mesopotamian underworld imagery may draw some of its emotional texture from this hidden water world. Wells, seepage, sudden dampness in a foundation trench. These are everyday reminders that the earth below is not dead. It moves. It stores. It leaks. A careful reading might suggest that when myths imagine a realm below with its own rules, it resonates because the below surface world is genuinely different, cooler, darker, wet, unpredictable. And what if, in a cinematic, what if you imagine the underworld as the city's water shadow, a network of unseen flows that sustain life above like veins beneath skin? You can't see the entire system at once, but you can feel it. You can hear it when the night goes quiet. Most historians agree that wells and water management were critical, and archaeology suggests that canals had to be maintained constantly, silt removed, banks repaired, breaches patched. This is the kind of work that doesn't end. It's like owning a house, except your house is the entire agricultural system and your HOA is the laws of physics. You watch workers dredging a canal section. They scoop mud. They haul it away. Their movements are slow and repetitive, and after a while the sound becomes soothing scoop lift, dump, repeat. You could fall asleep to it, honestly, if your brain didn't keep offering you unhelpful comments like, "Imagine doing this without sunscreen." Here's one of your light jokes. You think you're tired now. Try being a canal in Mesopotamia. You never get a day off. You get silted, you get repaired, you get silted again. You're basically a treadmill for water. Now your title's mining question wants to connect to deep underground, and water gives you an unexpected bridge, because one of the most valuable resources in a dry landscape is not metal, not gold, not even bitumen. It's reliable water. What's broadly accepted is that irrigation made intensive agriculture possible in southern Mesopotamia. One interpretation is that the deep in underworld stories may partly reflect the reality that life depends on what lies beneath. Groundwater, river channels, moisture in soil. The city's survival is anchored to invisible reserves. Historians still argue whether the earliest large-scale irrigation systems were primarily organised by centralised institutions like temples and elites, or whether they developed through community-level coordination that later became institutionalized. There's no full consensus, and it likely varies by time and region, but the evidence we do have points to both collaboration and hierarchy playing roles. You pass a well and you look down. The well is a literal hole into the below world. It's dark. It's cool. The air rising from it feels different, like the earth has its own breath. You hear a faint echo when a bucket drops. That echo is an ancient sound. It's probably the same sound someone heard 4,000 years ago and thought even briefly, there's a whole other place down there. A careful reading might suggest that wells are natural myth makers. They are entrances, they are boundaries, they are sources, and in many cultures sources become sacred. It's possible that the act of pulling water from the earth, a life-giving liquid rising from darkness, contributed to the emotional vocabulary that later texts use for the underworld and the deep. Now, because we're keeping the 70-30 balance, we'll let a fringe idea appear, then treat it gently. A fringe idea proposes that deep underground references in modern Anunnaki narratives might point to literal subterranean facilities connected to water control energy or resource extraction hidden from ancient and modern eyes alike. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives because water and underground spaces feel like the perfect setting for secrets. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a mood, the idea that the most important systems are the ones you can't see. To be clear, this is debated. The mainstream explanation is already strong. Irrigation and water management are well documented and profoundly important, and they require human organisation and labour. You don't need hidden beings to explain why canals exist. Humans will dig canals with astonishing determination when the alternative is starvation. Still, the what if has its place. What if the ancient stories about realms below are partly the mind's way of honouring what it depends on but cannot fully control? Water rises, falls, disappears, returns. It seeps into foundations, it turns fields green, it turns streets into mud, it feels alive. So the imagination gives it a realm. You walk along the canal until it splits into smaller branches. This branching looks like a diagram, like writing in the landscape, and your reed stylus motif taps you again. Irrigation is a kind of inscription. You carve lines into earth and water follows them. You write a channel and the river reads it. One interpretation is that this might help explain why Mesopotamian thought is so comfortable with seeing the world as ordered by lines, boundaries, measures and assignments. When your survival depends on carved channels and measured flows, order becomes sacred, chaos becomes the enemy. The underworld then is not only a realm of dead, it's also a realm of forces that must be managed. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian underworld myths are primarily about death and afterlife beliefs, or whether they also function as broader metaphors for hidden natural systems and social control. There's no full consensus, and again, it may be both. Cultures often use one image to speak about several realities at once. You pause and listen to the water. It's soft, continuous, like a lullaby, and you realise that when you say deep underground, you might be talking about water in the most literal way. The groundwater table, the seepage, the wells. the hidden reserve that keeps fields alive. So the solid ground for tonight is simple water, management is central documented and labour intensive. The interpretation is plausible. Underworld imagery may borrow from experiences of hidden water and the below surface world. And the cinematic what if is gentle. What if the deep places are where the city's true lifelines run unseen but essential? Your reed stylus taps once more against your thumb. The canal water keeps moving, and you keep walking guided by the sound that never sleeps. You keep walking until the ground changes in a way your feet can feel before your eyes can explain it. The soil becomes slightly looser as if it has been disturbed and settled again. The air holds a cooler note. And then you see it, a doorway that isn't really a doorway because it's just an opening in the earth, an entrance. That could be a pit, a grave, a storage cavity, a foundation trench. In this landscape, the below world doesn't always announce itself. It just appears. What's broadly accepted is that the Mesopotamian underworld was a major religious concept, often described as a shadowy realm of the dead, with its own rules and boundaries. Archaeology suggests that burial practices in Mesopotamia varied across time and place, and that people placed the dead in graves, tombs, jars, or other forms of interment, depending on social status and local tradition. The evidence we do have points to a culture deeply aware of thresholds between living and dead, between inside and outside, between sealed and open. Now here's the part that matters for your metaphor map tonight. One interpretation is that the underworld in myth can function like a bundle of lived experiences, burial spaces under floors, pits where clay is taken, wells that descend into cool darkness, storerooms that are sealed and guarded, the old city layers beneath the new. The underworld becomes the story space where everything hidden gets placed. Ancestors, resources, laws, fear, memory. And what if in a cinematic? What if you imagine that every time a worker digs a foundation trench, they're briefly touching the edge of the underworld, not in a spooky way, in a practical way. They open the earth, see its layers, feel its cool breath, and then close it again with bricks. The city is constantly opening and closing the ground like someone flipping pages in a book and then pressing it shut. A careful reading might suggest that underworld narratives with gates and boundaries resonate in a place where so much of life is about controlled access, sealed jars, sealed doors, sealed tablets, sealed graves. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian religion involved ritual and order. One interpretation is that order is comforting precisely because so much else is unstable: floods, droughts, politics, disease. The underworld becomes the ultimate ordered realm. You go there and you don't come back. That's the rule. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian underworld stories were meant to be taken as literal descriptions of an afterlife geography, or primarily as mythic frameworks for understanding mortality and social order. There's no full consensus, and different texts may lean differently, but the evidence we do have points to underworld imagery being emotionally powerful and culturally central. You step closer to the opening in the ground and look down. It's dark. The edge is crumbly. The air coming up is cool and faintly damp. You hear the smallest echo when a pebble falls. Your modern brain wants a flashlight app. Your ancient brain wants a lamp and a prayer. Your reed stylus motif shows up again, but now it feels different, less like a writing tool and more like a small, fragile thing you might hold for comfort. Because beneath the city, there are often tablets too. Archaeology suggests that some tablets end up buried, discarded, stored, lost, collapsed into debris, becoming part of the tell layers. The city's records, in a sense, descend into the earth over time. The underworld of the site becomes an archive. One interpretation is that this physical descent of tablets into layers could strengthen the cultural sense that truth and memory live below. Again, that's interpretation, not certainty. But it's a useful thought. The earth becomes a storage medium. The underworld becomes where the city's past waits. Now you feel the story's promise, tugging the underworld as a metaphor map. So let's lay it out gently, like you're tracing lines on damp clay. Wells are literal descents into hidden water. Pits are descents into clay and earth. Graves are descents into death and memory. Storerooms are descents into controlled wealth. Old city layers are descents into time. Each one has its own emotional flavour, but they all share one thing: they are below, and they are not meant for casual wandering. That's why deep underground feels meaningful even when no one is digging a modern tunnel. Depth is not just measurement. Depth is meaning. And now, because your title keeps bringing the Anunnaki into this, we hold that thread carefully. A fringe idea proposes that references to underworld gods and assemblies encode literal underground operations, mines, chambers, or facilities run by powerful beings. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it plays on the strong underworld imagery in Mesopotamian tradition. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a storytelling question. Why do we so readily imagine powerful agents in hidden spaces? A more cautious explanation could be that the underworld is the natural home for power in the imagination because it is inaccessible. Anything inaccessible can be filled with meaning. The deeper it is, the harder it is to check. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. To be clear, this is debated. The mainstream understanding remains. The underworld in Mesopotamian texts is largely a religious and mythic concept tied to death, order, and cosmic structure. But the fact that it overlaps so neatly with real below-surface experiences, wells, pits, grave storage, makes it a rich metaphor space, whether the writers intended that overlap consciously or not. You move away from the opening and into a residential area where houses cluster. You notice something quietly intimate. In some Mesopotamian contexts, burials could be associated with domestic spaces placed under floors or near households. The evidence we do have points to practices that keep ancestors close, literally beneath daily life. That closeness can make the underworld feel not far away, not distant, but right there, beneath the mat where you sit, beneath the hearth where you cook. One interpretation is that living above burials could shape how people imagine the boundary between worlds: thin, layered, persistent. Again, not certainty, but plausible. Historians still argue whether domestic burial practices reflect beliefs about ancestor protection, household continuity, social identity, or practical constraints of space, and there's no full consensus. But the resonance is strong. The below world is part of the home. And here comes one of your light jokes. If you ever think your apartment has bad storage, just remember that ancient people sometimes stored their ancestors under the floor. Suddenly your closet feels luxurious. You pass a small shrine area, maybe a place where offerings are left. A bowl, a bit of food, a small poured libation. In a culture where gods and spirits are present in daily thinking offerings, are a kind of relationship maintenance. The underworld isn't just feared, it's acknowledged. A careful reading might suggest that underworld stories can serve as social instructions. Respect boundaries, honour the dead, obey the rules that keep chaos from spilling into the living world. And that in turn connects back to your resource theme, because resource systems also rely on boundaries, seals, gates, allocations. The underworld is the mythic mirror of administrative control. Historians still argue whether the strength of underworld gate imagery in Mesopotamia reflects a particularly urban gate-focused culture or broader Near Eastern myth patterns, and there's no full consensus. But what's broadly accepted is that gates mattered physically, socially, and symbolically. So tonight you hold the underworld as a map of hidden things, hidden water, hidden clay, hidden wealth, hidden memory, hidden death. And you realise that deep underground might be the ancient way of saying this is beyond casual reach. Your reed stylus taps once softly, as if marking a boundary line on a tablet. The fan hum continues, and the city above its own buried layers keeps living. You keep the underworld map in your mind, like a folded cloth, wells here, pits there, storerooms and graves and old layers under everything. And now you start listening for the smallest things, words. Not the big dramatic ones like Anunnaki, but the practical verbs that society uses when it actually has to do stuff. Because if you want to understand whether mining is really present in the texts, you have to respect the fact that ancient languages don't slice the world into the same neat categories modern English does. A single sign can carry a family of meanings. A phrase can be both literal and poetic at once. And sometimes the closest thing to mine is just dig, take, bring, out, open, gather. Most historians agree that Sumerian and Akkadian writing systems are complex, and that meanings can shift by context, genre, and time. Archaeology suggests scribal schools trained students through repetition, which preserved certain expressions but also standardized them. The evidence we do have points to language that can feel deceptively simple on the surface, wedge marks in clay while hiding layers of nuance. One interpretation is that modern readers sometimes over-translate ancient imagery into modern technical terms. They see the depths and assume mine. They see bringing out and assume excavation. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it's why careful reading matters. Historians still argue whether certain recurring depth phrases in Mesopotamian literary texts should be understood primarily as cosmological metaphors or as references that also draw on everyday physical experiences like digging, building, and water management. There's no full consensus because the same phrase can live in both worlds at once. You imagine yourself in a scribal classroom again because tonight everything returns to clay. A teacher points at a sign and says its values. A student repeats them softly like a lullaby of syllables. The student presses the sign into a tablet, then looks up, waiting for approval. The teacher's expression is neutral, in the way only teachers can be neutral enough to conceal either pride or disappointment, or air. A careful reading might suggest that scribes were trained not only to write, but to think in categories, measures, lists, types of work, types of materials. The administrative world loves categories. The mythic world loves images. And the same language can serve both. So when you encounter words that might be translated as earth, ground depth, foundation, pit, open cut, you have to ask which world is the text speaking in right now. What's broadly accepted is that many tablets are administrative and use technical vocabulary for labour and materials. In those contexts, digging might be literal, digging canals, digging pits, cutting earth. Archaeology supports that these activities were real and common. In literary texts, the same root images might be used metaphorically, the depths as a realm of gods, the earth as a source of life, the foundation as cosmic order. One interpretation is that this overlap is not accidental. It's how human language works. We borrow from the physical world to speak about the unseen. And what if in a cinematic, what if you imagine that the reveal in your title is really a reveal about translation? What if the mystery is not that the texts hide secret minds, but that our modern minds keep wanting them to? You and I bring our own expectations, our own movies, our own headlines into ancient lines. That's not an accusation. It's just a gentle reminder that imagination is eager. It runs ahead. And tonight we're teaching it to walk. Now, to honour the outline contract, we focus on words that might mean mine, but will stay mainstream safe. We won't pretend a single sign proves a single modern claim. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The evidence we do have points to words and phrases in Mesopotamian languages that relate to digging and earthwork terms for canals, pits, foundations, and extraction of materials like clay. Those are solid. They belong to daily life. When you read administrative texts, you see labour categories and tasks that likely include digging and carrying. One interpretation is that when later readers see down below language in myths, they may be tempted to map it directly onto these real tasks. But a more cautious explanation could be that myths use the same imagery without necessarily pointing to the same activity. Below in myth may be spiritual depth, not a work site. Historians still argue whether the presence of practical earthwork vocabulary alongside mythic depths language indicates deliberate metaphor making by authors or simply reflects the fact that both writers and audiences lived in a world where digging and water management were omnipresent. There's no full consensus, and honestly, it's probably both. You walk through a construction site in your imagination. A trench is being cut. Workers are moving soil. A foreman is gesturing. A scribe is nearby, or maybe not right here, but not far, because someone has to record who worked and who gets rations. The verbs here are plain dig, carry, pile, level. Now you walk through a mythic scene in your imagination. A god descends, gates close, a realm below is described. The verbs there might be similar: descend, open, close, bring out, take. The difference is that in myth, the objects are not always baskets of earth. They're sometimes destinies, judgments, sacred powers. The overlap in verbs can make the worlds feel connected, and that's where interpretation begins. Now, because your topic includes Anunnaki, we have to acknowledge a modern pattern. A popular rumour claims that certain terms in ancient texts directly encode advanced technological mining. This theory isn't widely accepted, and in many cases the linguistic claims made in popular retellings are oversimplified or disputed. To be clear, this is debated. A more cautious explanation could be that people often underestimate how poetic and multi-layered ancient religious language is, then overestimate how literal their own translations are. If we treat that rumour as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can still offer a useful lesson. It shows how powerful word choice is. A translator who chooses mine instead of dig changes the entire mental movie. A translator who chooses facility instead of storehouse changes the emotional temperature. The underworld becomes a bunker. The pit becomes a shaft. And suddenly the story feels like science fiction. One interpretation is that our own era's fascination with hidden technology encourages those choices. That's not proof of anything ancient, it's a mirror of us. Historians still argue whether modern popular interpretations of Mesopotamian myths reveal more about ancient texts or more about modern cultural anxieties and desires about power, control, resources and origins. There's no full consensus, but it's an important debate because it helps keep us honest. Here's your light joke: translation is like assembling furniture without instructions. If you pick the wrong piece early, everything looks like a spaceship by the end. And yes, you will blame the manufacturer, even if it was you. You return to your reed stylus motif, and you realise it's also a symbol of translation itself. The stylus presses a wedge into clay. The wedge can mean several things depending on how it's used. Meaning is shaped by context. That's the point. So the solid ground here is that Mesopotamian texts contain language about digging and earthwork, because those activities were real and essential. The interpretation is that mythic depth language may borrow from those experiences, but it does not automatically point to literal mining operations. The cinematic what if is gentle and self-aware. What if the real mystery is how easily a single translation choice can turn a canal trench into an underground mine in your imagination? Historians still argue whether the best way to read these texts is to prioritize their religious and literary functions, or to treat them as windows into social and economic life. And the answer is usually both carefully. That's why we keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You keep walking with that in mind, slowly, quietly, like you're carrying a wet tablet that hasn't dried yet, careful not to smudge the marks. You keep walking, but now the landscape starts to feel less like a single scene and more like a system. The city is behind you, the canal is beside you, the storerooms are somewhere in your mind, and the underworld map is folded in your pockets like a secret you're allowed to carry, but not allowed to declare. And you begin to notice a pattern that's so simple it almost hides in plain sight. Resources aren't just materials, they're leverage. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian cities depended on managing scarce resources and coordinating labour, and what's broadly accepted is that institutions like temples and palaces played major roles in organising production and distribution. The evidence we do have points to a world where authority often attaches itself to whoever can stabilise the unstable water-grain trade and work. One interpretation is that myths about gods assigning roles, setting cosmic order and receiving offerings can be read as narrative reflections of that stabilisation, not because the myths are secretly economic textbooks, but because economic life is part of what people are trying to make sense of. Stories are how humans explain why the world feels the way it feels. And in Mesopotamia, the world feels like allocation. And what if in a cinematic, what if you imagine the underworld as the ultimate allocation room? A place where destinies are assigned like rations. A place where gates are rules. A place where the deep is where decisions are made that the surface world must live with. A careful reading might suggest that the underworld's emphasis on restriction gates, boundaries, limited return mirrors the logic of scarcity. If there isn't enough of something, access is controlled. And controlled access is basically the definition of power. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian myths about divine justice and cosmic order were primarily theological narratives or also served as social frameworks that helped legitimize authority and hierarchy. There's no full consensus, but it's widely recognized that myths and rituals can support social structures even when that's not their only purpose. Now you step into a street market in your imagination. It's not glossy, it's dusty and practical. People are trading, someone is bargaining, someone is complaining about prices, which is a timeless human hobby. You smell bread onions, maybe fish if the river is close. A merchant has copper items laid out. Someone else has wool. Someone else has jars of oil. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian economies included both institutional redistribution and private exchange in varying forms across time. Archaeology suggests evidence for craft production, trade goods and market-like activities, though the exact structure is debated. The evidence we do have points to a complex picture, temple and palace, systems, household production, merchants, and networks that overlap. One interpretation is that in such complexity, myths become a way to simplify. They create a story where everything has a place. Gods are in charge. Rules exist. Work has meaning. Offerings return favour. Even if real life is messy, the myth offers a clean diagram. And what if that's the why in your title, not why did they mine, but why did people imagine mining or deep extraction in cosmic terms? Because deep systems resource, flows obligations, trade routes are hard to see. They're invisible to most people, and invisible forces invite myth. Your read stylus motif taps you again. Writing makes invisible obligations visible. That's why it's powerful. A scribe can make a promise last beyond the moment. A seal can make access controlled. A tablet can turn a day's labour into a line item. One interpretation is that writing itself becomes a kind of underworld tool. It stores commitments in cool, dark rooms. It outlasts people. It binds the living to past decisions. That's not spooky, but it's a little uncanny. The city's rules live in clay. You can break a seal, but you can't unwrite a record once it's accepted. Historians still argue whether early Mesopotamian writing should be understood mainly as a pragmatic invention for administration, or also as a cultural shift that reshaped how people thought about law, time, and authority. There's no full consensus, but the evidence we do have points to writing becoming deeply embedded in power structures. Now, your contract requires that each section includes a quirky or fringe tidbit clearly framed. Here's one that fits without taking over. A fringe idea proposes that myths of gods and underworld assemblies preserve a memory of actual hidden decision centres, secret councils, underground chambers, or concealed authorities, sometimes modernised into Anunnaki narratives of control. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it's psychologically interesting because it externalises the feeling of being managed by forces you don't see. To be clear, this is debated, and a more cautious explanation could be that complex societies naturally generate the sensation of hidden control because no single person can see the whole system. When you don't see the full network, it feels like someone else must. And what if in a cinematic? What if you imagine the city as a machine with its gears below the floor? Not literal gears, organisational gears, water schedules, grain distributions, work assignments, trade contracts, all of it turning in the dark, out of sight. The gods in myths become the faces. You can talk to the names. You can blame or thank, even if the real machine is human bureaucracy and natural constraints. Here's your light joke. People say, bureaucracy is soulless, but ancient Mesopotamia proves it has a soul. And that soul is made of clay and mild existential dread. You step out of the market and toward the edge of the city where the canal meets fields. You see how everything is connected, water to grain, grain to rations, rations to labour, labour to construction, construction to storage, storage to authority. It's a chain, and chains are comforting in a way because they suggest causality. Do this, get that. Maintain this, prevent that. One interpretation is that myths take that chain and turn it into cosmic causality, honour. The gods receive abundance. Neglect rituals invite disorder. Again, that's interpretation, not certainty. But it explains why resource themes can feel religious. Resources decide survival. Survival invites sacred attention. Historians still argue whether the rise of early states in Mesopotamia is best explained by environmental pressures, economic specialization, warfare ideology, or combinations that shift across time. There's no full consensus, and the evidence supports multiple contributing factors. But what's broadly accepted is that resource management is central. Now you bring the Anunnaki thread in softly. In mainstream scholarship, Anunnaki are deities within Mesopotamian religious frameworks, not a single modern-style faction with a mining business plan. One interpretation is that modern retellings compress multiple deities and themes into a single narrative because it's easier for modern audiences to hold. That compression creates the illusion of a single motive mining. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a way to explore why we love simple motives. And what if the simplest motive they mined, a valuable thing, is a modern echo of an ancient truth? People have always known that resources shape destiny. The difference is that ancient people told that truth through gods, and modern people sometimes tell it through conspiracies. So the solid ground here is the system resource flows and labour organisation are documented, complex and central. The interpretation is that myths may reflect and legitimise the logic of scarcity and allocation. And the cinematic what if is gentle, what if, deep underground, is where the invisible decisions of a society live, decisions that shape lives above without being seen. Your reed stylus taps once more like a little gavel. The fan hum stays steady, and you feel the story leaning toward its final sorting, what's solid, what's missed, what's mood. You reach the point in the walk where your mind naturally wants a clean answer, the kind you can put on a label and stick on a jar. This is what they mined. This is why. But ancient worlds don't hand out neat labels without charging interest. So you do what a good sleepy historian does. You sort. Not to declare a final truth, never that, but to separate the solid ground from the mist, and the mist from the mood. The evidence we do have points to a straightforward mainstream picture of what mattered most in early Mesopotamia clay for bricks and writing reeds for everyday construction and tools, bitumen for waterproofing, and imported materials like copper, tin, stone and timber to fill the gaps geography created. Archaeology suggests these resources shape cities, labour systems, trade networks and the rise of institutions. Most historians agree that this material story is real, massive and already dramatic. One interpretation is that myths and religious texts borrow from this material story because it is the texture of life. When you spend your days digging canals, hauling clay, sealing boats and counting rations, your metaphors come pre-soaked in mud and water. So when a myth talks about the depths, it might be about death, yes, but it might also feel like pits, wells and foundations. When a myth talks about divine order, it might be theology, yes, but it may also resonate with the daily experience of allocation and control. Historians still argue whether the strongest connections between Mesopotamian myths and Mesopotamian economic life are intentional reflections by authors or unconscious overlaps arising from shared experience. There's no full consensus, and the answer likely shifts by genre. A hymn does one thing, a mythic epic does another, an administrative tablet does a third. You walk back through your own mental list like a scribe reviewing inventory at the end of a long day. Clay the silent empire, bitumen the black seal, copper and bronze the traded skeleton of tools, tin the ghost ingredients, water the unseen lifeline, temples the engines, underworld imagery the map of hidden things. Now you take the next step. Your outline promised. You acknowledge the modern fringe, but you hold it with two hands like a fragile bowl. A popular rumour claims that the Anunnaki were literal non-human beings who mined specific minerals, often gold, deep underground for their own purposes. This theory isn't widely accepted. To be clear, this is debated. A more cautious explanation could be that modern Anunnaki narratives are often built from a mix of ancient names, translated mythic scenes, and contemporary fascination with hidden technology and resource motives. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can still be valuable not as evidence, but as a lens for asking why the deep underground mining idea is so compelling. One interpretation is that it's compelling because it compresses complexity into a single motive. Mesopotamian history is sprawling multiple city-states, changing dynasties, shifting economies, evolving religious traditions, and centuries of scribes copying and reshaping compositions. It's a lot. So a single motive they mined, gold, feels like relief. It's a shortcut for the brain. Another interpretation is that the idea of hidden underground mining externalizes modern anxieties. Today, people know that resources shape geopolitics, that supply chains can collapse, that rare materials can change what technologies exist. So when we look back at the ancient world, we sometimes project our own resource-obsessed worldview into it, and imagine a cosmic version beings with a master plan and a single extraction goal. And what if the truth, such as it is softer and more human ancient people lived in a landscape where survival depended on unseen systems, water below the surface, clay beneath the footpath, trade routes beyond the horizon, stored grain behind sealed doors? Their myths gave those systems faces and rules. Modern people living in a world of hidden systems too, data centers, supply chains, mines in distant regions, do the same thing just with different costumes. Historians still argue whether modern ancient alien readings of Mesopotamian myth should be treated purely as entertainment or as cultural phenomena that reveal meaningful patterns in how people interpret the past. There's no full consensus, but it's widely recognized that these narratives are modern creations layered onto ancient material, not straightforward continuations of ancient belief. Now let's self-correct carefully where people often overstep. It would be misleading to say Sumerian texts reveal a literal underground mining operation by the Anunnaki in a direct technical sense. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Some Sumerian and Akkadian texts contain underworld imagery, divine labour themes, and language about depths and earth. And modern interpretations sometimes connect these motifs to mining narratives. That's a possibility, not a certainty. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. What is documented is that Mesopotamians extracted materials like clay and bitumen and organised labour to do large-scale earthwork. What is interpreted is how mythic language relates to those realities. What is imagined is the cinematic what-if of hidden chambers and singular motives. And because your channel is sleep-friendly, you don't need to pick a fight with the rumour. You can simply place it on the shelf, labelled interesting, not conclusive, and move on. Here's your light joke for the 1,000 the ancient world already has enough plot twists without adding aliens, like the fact that an entire civilization ran on mud barley and administrative tablets, which is the least glamorous origin story and also somehow the most impressive. You feel your reed stylus motif in your hand again. It's light. It's ordinary. and it reminds you that the strongest reveal in Mesopotamian text is often not a secret object, but a visible system, how humans built complex life out of fragile materials and strict routines. One interpretation is that when you read these texts as bedtime history, the best mystery isn't what did they mine, but how did they make it work? How did they coordinate water labour and trade with no engines, no electricity, and no group chats? How did they keep cities functioning when the environment was both generous and harsh? Historians still argue whether early Mesopotamian urban success depended more on environmental advantage, institutional innovation, or cultural cohesion expressed through religion and shared myth. There's no full consensus, but the evidence we do have points to a braided answer, all of the above, in changing proportions. So you stand at the edge of the city again in your mind and look back. You see pits and canals, storerooms and seals, workshops, and scribes' temples and offerings. You see the underworld not as a literal tunnel network, but as a concept that gathers everything, hidden resources, memory, death rules. And what if in a cinematic, what if the deep underground mine is simply the human imagination's way of saying, the things that matter most are often out of sight? That's a gentle thought. It doesn't demand belief. It invites reflection. Your fan hum continues, your breath slows, and you feel the story preparing for its final quiet, sorting one last look at what we can't know, and then a soft descent into rest. You come to the last stretch of the walk, the way you come to the edge of sleep slowly, with fewer sharp thoughts and more soft ones. The city behind you is quieter now, not because it has stopped working, but because your attention is loosening its grip. The canal still moves, the wind still combs the reeds. Somewhere a dog barks once and then decides it's not worth the effort, which is honestly an energy-saving strategy you could learn from. Most historians agree that the most reliable way to understand ancient Mesopotamia is to hold two truths together. The material world was real and demanding, and the mythic world was real and meaningful. Archaeology suggests people built cities on an alluvial plain using clay reeds and bitumen, while acquiring metal, stone and timber through trade. The evidence we do have points to labour systems, record-keeping temple and palace institutions, and the daily struggle to manage water. At the same time, texts and rituals speak of gods, duties, order, and the underworld giving shape to fears and hopes that don't fit neatly into inventory lists. One interpretation is that your original question, what were the Anunnaki mining deep underground, and why, becomes less like a riddle with one answer and more like a mirror with several reflections. On solid ground, mining can mean the obvious extraction of earth materials, clay from pits, bitumen from seeps, and the broader dependence on distant mining landscapes for copper and tin that reached Mesopotamia through trade. On misty ground, deep underground, can be an image, a way to speak about hidden systems, water below the surface, wealth behind seals, memory in buried tablets, and the past layered beneath the present. And in the calm, cinematic what if it can become a mood, the sense that the most important things are often unseen. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian underworld imagery should be interpreted primarily as afterlife belief as broader metaphor for hidden natural and social systems, or as a shifting blend of both depending on time and text. There's no full consensus, but the debate itself is gentle proof of something. These stories are deep because they can hold multiple meanings without breaking. Now, because we've carried the modern rumour carefully all night, we set it down without drama. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were literal non-human beings with a single extraction motive, often framed as gold mining in deep underground facilities. This theory isn't widely accepted, and to be clear, this is debated. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it remains what it is best at being a provocative what if. That can make you pay attention to resources, depth and power without forcing you to pretend the evidence is stronger than it is. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The ancient texts do not hand us a clean technical description of underground mining operations. What they do give us are vivid images of depths, gates, labour and divine order. The evidence we do have points strongly to real practical resource worlds beneath those images: earthwork, waterwork, trade, sealing and accounting. The rest is interpretation, and some of it is gentle imagination. And here's the last light joke for the road. If you ever want to feel spiritually humbled, just remember that the deep secrets of one of humanity's earliest urban civilizations include clay tablets listing barley rations. It's like finding the Dead Sea Scrolls and realizing they're mostly receipts. Legendary, yes. Glamorous, no. Your reed stylus motif returns one final time and you turn it in your fingers. It's a small thing, a cut piece of plant, but it represents the quiet miracle of this place. Humans took river mud and reed stalks and turned them into cities and stories. They didn't need a single hidden truth to do it. They needed cooperation, discipline, and the stubborn ability to keep building even when the river tried to erase their work. You look out across the plain in your imagination and you notice how the ground itself feels like a page. The canal lines are writing. The fields are paragraphs. The city is a thick layered book of clay, sealed with bitumen, bound by labour. The underworld is not only beneath it, the underworld is inside it, inside the layers, inside the sealed rooms, inside the records that make a society remember itself. And now, because the outline promised it, we soften, we slow down, we let the vocabulary soften and the sentences lengthen, and we stop asking questions that demand answers. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Wind down within section 15. You can almost hear the city settling like a house at night, wood and brick, adjusting to the day's heat leaving them. The canal keeps murmuring, and the sound is simple enough that your mind doesn't need to solve it. Water doesn't ask you to understand. It just moves patient and steady, carrying the same calm message over and over. In the dark, the idea of deep underground loses its sharp edges. It becomes less like a hole you might fall into, and more like a soft place where things rest. Clay rests there. Old walls rest there. Forgotten tablets rest there, still holding their wedge marks the way a dream holds a shape, even after you wake. Even the stories rest there, layered under other stories, waiting until someone touches them again with curiosity and care. And if you want a final image to carry you towards sleep, let it be small and harmless. Imagine your reed stylus lying on a cool clay tablet, not writing, not proving anything, just resting. The tablet is damp but drying. The air is cooler near the floor. Somewhere outside, reeds brush together in the wind like a quiet applause that no one needs to earn. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And that's okay, because tonight you don't need certainty. You only need the soft feeling of following clues, gently letting the solid ground stay solid, letting the mist stay mist, and letting your thoughts drift the way water drifts through a canal at night.